Qu'y a-t-il de nouveau?
J'ai entendu deux jeunes filles dans le tramway, elles parlaient de vous.
Ah oui? Qu'est-ce qu'elles disaient?
Elles racontaient des histoires à votre sujet.
Qui étaient drôles?
Très drôle, si drôle que deux dames qui étaient aussi dans le tramway ont demandé votre adresse.
Bah dis donc, va falloir déménager alors. Je m'en vais chez Maxime.
Vous n'allez pas vous rendre à l'ambassade, mon capitaine?
Demain matin. Je m'en vais chez Maxime.
Mais mon capitaine!
Je m'en vais chez Maxime, car je suis au régime des vins qui émoustillent et des charmantes filles. Manon, Lison, Ninon, Fanchon, Susan, Toinon, j'éprouve pour chacune une éternelle passion.
Welcome to Season 5 of How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch, one film at a time. This week, our penultimate episode with Cahiers du Cinéma deputy editor Charlotte Garson. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing, a link to our Discord, or just to say hi. Hello, everyone. We're here with Charlotte Garson. She is the deputy editor of a very small, obscure, independent French journal called the Cahiers du Cinéma. It is such a thrill to have you on the show, Charlotte. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here.
So I'd like to first start with a question inspired by your email. You mentioned that you have a long history with Lubitsch that lasts, almost your whole life. You encountered Lubitsch Cinema when you were a child, and this influenced your decision to become a critic in the first place.
Well, I'm trying not to mythologize that too much. It's just I was lucky enough that I was living near Paris, and as you know, in the Latin Quarter, there are all these art house cinemas. There were just reruns of Lubitsch films all the time. Maybe the same ones, but not even, it wasn't just 5 of them. I remember having seen That Uncertain Feeling, for example, for a while, and it's never screened again. So when I was a child, it so happened that we would always pick up the little brochure that lists all the films that are being screened in Paris, and that's a lot of them per week. And then we would read the little blurbs, and we would choose according to the director, but also first, I guess, the actors and the plots, and then we kind of worked our way into recognizing directors like McCarey and Hawks and Hitchcock and Lubitsch. So I remember seeing Cluny Brown. I think it was probably the first Lubitsch film I saw. At least I remember that I was really thrilled by that. And I'm just wondering, I don't have an answer, but I'm wondering when you start, watching these films at an early age, how does it shape your worldview? There's one thing that concerns the love life that I can get into, if you'd like to, maybe later, because it's a little intimate and we're at the beginning of the recording. But then there's another thing, which is I did become a film critic. And quite early on, I realized I didn't want to be an actress, but I wanted to be a film critic. But there was a connection between wanted to be the object of the gaze and wanted to be a little at more of a distance and kind of behind the scenes. I do think seeing Lubitsch films, well, 2 things. One, I think seeing Lubitsch films at an early age makes you aware of matters of representation. I guess that's a little theoretical to say that, but wouldn't you agree that there's a theatricality that's more obvious, I guess, in his films than in other people's movies, and how it helps seeing the world as a stage in a way?
No, I think there's a preoccupation in a lot of his cinema with artifice and staginess. I mean, we can see that as early as The Doll. It opens with him setting the stage, something like, I think it's Carmen, where it opens with him opening a book and essentially saying, we're going to read Carmen today, essentially. And then all the way to Be or Not to Be, which I think probably our listeners have heard quite a lot about its staginess, probably all stems back to his literal time on the stage.
I really love The Doll. I think it's really one of my favorite ones. And I haven't seen it as a child. I saw it when I was maybe 30. That would be almost 20 years ago. But in any case, I really love the fact that at first you kind of think it's maybe a little too easy for him to play the guy who takes out the little toy people and all that. It's cute, but it's more like a fairy tale thing. And then what I really loved is the fact that in that film, there are 2 dolls. I think the apprentice, do you remember? The little guy who's the apprentice of the doll maker and who helps with the lie of the real girl posing as the doll. The last time I watched The Doll, it just jumped to my face that this guy was really Lubitsch. Like, first you see Lubitsch as the big guy taking out the small people out of the box, but then you have the small Lubitsch vandalizing the whole set. Remember the doll maker's workshop? being completely destroyed by him. Whereas at first you think he's just feels very guilty about having done all that. And then he breaks everything. It just became obvious that he was the creator, the new creator, destroying everything and being the new Lubitsch, don't you think? I mean, I just love that. I don't know what it means.
There's that ambiguity in the title, right? Because in the film, in the story, in the diegesis, you have Ossie Oswalda is the doll, right? She is the doll that is created, but she's in a world entirely inhabited by dolls. That naturally leads to the reading of the inventor of Ossie the doll, who is also the name of the actress, blurring many lines there, being essentially that universe's equivalent of Ernst Lubitsch setting out the dollhouse.
Yeah, I mean, this thing of a doll playing a woman, playing a doll, playing a woman, I don't know when it ends. But it also made me think that it may be obvious about the film, but it does connect to today's feminism in the way femininity is always performed. It seems obvious, but I think it's really powerful in the way it's done in the doll. And there's also the fact that how a respectable woman is actually an automat in the film, because when the guy who wants to marry a doll says, I want to marry a respectable woman, and that would be the definition of a woman who doesn't eat, who doesn't have desires. And so I think it's quite, it's still valuable as a critique of any kind of ideology, really. It's still very much contemporary. And of course, it works with the other one, I Wouldn't Want to Be a Man, where she also performs, I guess, manhood in order to finally strip herself from the man's clothes and decide that it's actually better to be a woman. But don't you think that there's a direct connection with Design for Living's famous line, unfortunately, I am no gentleman?
It's true we have a gentleman's agreement. But unfortunately, I am no gentleman.
Like, that's how you get to realize your desire, how you define yourself as a woman through finding out about your sexual desire. That proves that you're a woman in a way. But first, you put yourself in the camp of gentlemen, or at least, you live with men as if they're just your roommates. Or in the silent one, in I Wouldn't Want to Be a Man, you hesitate between the two bathroom doors. But eventually at the end, and I think you talked about that in the episode, eventually in that film, she does choose to be a woman, and that could be seen as almost reactionary or conservative, but I don't think that. I think it's you strip yourself off the gender identity in order to find that gender identity in sex, basically in sexual desire.
There's a real sense of, and I Don't Want to Be a Man. I listened to your introduction to the film that you had sent me. I'll post it in the show notes for a screening series that you did. You make a point that's really relevant to this, I think, which is that if we treat the film as a coming of age story, a film where, this girl, essentially, we can say if it's a coming of age story, she starts the film as a girl, ends the film as a woman, and kind of grows up. She matures in this movie. And part of that maturation is stripping herself of that womanhood, but also incorporating elements of manhood into her being. And so you get that wonderful blurring of the two, especially in the scene where she and her mentor slash friend slash suitor, where she lets her hair down, but still has the clothes of a man. And so she is fluidly moving along this spectrum of, gender presentation, at least, which, is very exciting, but also I think plays exactly into what you're saying, which is this idea that to fully self-actualize, she has to grapple with her status as, Miriam Hopkins would say in Design for Living, a gentleman or not a gentleman.
Yeah, and maybe we could be general today just because it's one of the last episodes. I'm hoping not the last one. I'm betting not the last one.
Second to last.
Second to last, okay. In a way, okay, I'm going to say something ridiculous probably when you start the sentence like that. Isn't it about having the body emerge under any kind of ideology? I was talking about bourgeois society, obviously, but it could be anything else. It could be in To Be or Not to Be. It could be the real ideologies that rule the world, that dictate violence to the world. But isn't it always about the body re-emerging under all that and, telling its own truth in a way? Not in a natural biological reality, but through desire, basically. In To Be or Not to Be, I think it's really interesting because I think it's the best intertwining of the big scale history and the very intimate sexual relationship that he's always dealt with, the triangulation of the couple. meaning it's not really a love. It's, I think, to me, never a real love triangle. It's more like the third person who can switch places helps create a distance between the two in the couple, like what Ninochka says in the film.
I'm interested only in the shortest distance between these 2 points. Must you flirt?
Maybe, for example, we can take Trouble in Paradise as an example of how, were it a Wilder film, it would be about almost prostitutional relationships within society. How even when you're in a love relationship, it ends up being a transaction, right? And in a way, it's what it's about, because in Trouble in Paradise, they are pickpockets and their whole erotic connection is through stealing objects from each other, and how you can basically indirectly touch the other person by getting the object that he or she is carrying on their own body. So there's really this sexualization of money with the whole thing with the $120,000 or $125,000 diamond bag and all that. I like the fact that it could be a film on that. It could be a film on how really between men and women and all that, between the love relationship, underneath them, they are really just social class relationships, and how it rules the game, and how all the thing with the clocks, like it's almost a big clockmaker. And in fact, I don't know if you'll agree, but it's not that in a way. It's not like a topic, or it's not as heavy-handed as in a Wilder film. And what I love about Trouble in Paradise is even when they say, when they betray each other, when they lie to each other, when they lie in order to steal Madame Collet, you realize as a viewer that as he is betraying her, he's loving her even more. It never ends. And as he is loving her, he's going to steal one more thing, from her. And then there's no end to that. It's like a freewheeling thing. And I've never really seen that in any other director.
Do you know what you're missing? No. That's what you're missing. Your gift to her.
But the compliments of Collet and company.
I was wondering, and I'm submitting this to your knowledge. So I was introducing Footlight Parade by Busby Berkeley a couple of years ago, and I kind of very quickly delved into the fact that at the time, which is exactly the time of Trouble in Paradise and most of Lubitsch's best films, there was this fashion in design, for example, but also in clothing, that was the streamline silhouettes. Every object, a car, an ashtray, they were all like very streamlined, very slick, very aerodynamical. And so you could think Trouble in Paradise follows that style, right? In the sets, the clothing, the figures of the actors and all that. But in fact, I realized that it wasn't ornamental in Lubitsch, that it was about the transactional relationship that they have among themselves. And I think in Trouble in Paradise is also when we hear an advertisement on the Collet perfumes on the radio, right?
Cleopatra was a lovely tantalizer, but she did it with her little atomizer.
It's one of the Lubitsch films where there's actually a lot about that, but we don't realize. Like what we keep from the film is not at all the kind of commerce, the commercial thing that's going on with them. But I love that it's all there, and yet it's not a topical film.
I mean, I can imagine the Billy Wilder version of this film, and not that it'd be, I love Wilder, but, a little less than Lubitsch. The Gaston character, Monesquieu, would be entirely different, because in this film, he is essentially, Lily even says, don't become one of those gigolos. And he is essentially one of those gigolos, but you don't feel it. Lubitsch takes his relationship with Madame Collet on its own terms as a genuine, sincere thing, despite the transactions. They clearly, maybe we don't call it love, maybe we just say they have a deep desire for each other, but the desire is real. In a Billy Wilder film, that desire is usually functional, power-based, and one-sided. You can pick from many, many Wilder films that have the gigolo character archetype, but Sunset Boulevard, right? The lead character, the Holden character in that, never once feels an ounce of actual attraction.
That's one of the weaknesses of that film. Because you could find somebody that age desiring that elderly actress. So I think it was a writing mistake in a way.
Yeah, and in Trouble in Paradise, to use a very basic word, very satisfying that every possible configuration of those relationships, there is substance there between the characters that Lubitsch respects. And that's very unusual, especially with a love triangle that's so economically skewed as that.
And there's never a bad guy. And again, the way I tend to think of films is because I introduce films in theaters. We are lucky enough here to have that almost as a job in and of itself. I mean, half a job. I'm introducing a cycle of Capra films. The contrast between Lubitsch and Capra, and it's not that one is conservative and the other one is liberal, or one is like familialist or anything like that. But for example, it helps to think, to sometimes to compare and contrast, to think of the fact that there is no mean guy in the Lubitsch films.
So you brought up Capra, which invokes a pre-taping conversation we had where you mentioned that with your film club, you are currently covering Frank Capra. You mentioned that we had not really talked about Capra on the podcast, which is totally true. I'd love to hear whatever you want to say about the contrasts or parallels between the two after watching all these Frank Capra films.
On the surface, I guess you would oppose them, right? For example, on that love triangle thing. Okay, I did get that most of the Capra movies, end with the forming of a traditional couple or the reuniting of a couple or a family. And I did notice that Lubitsch hardly ever falls under Stanley Cavell's concept of the remarriage comedies. Being a couple, when the film starts, they're already together and they're going to either go through a divorce or a really bad row. And then the whole film is about not how they get back together, but how they rediscover, they make their union afresh. I mean, it's not just getting back together. So I did notice that it's not what happens in most Lubitsch films. You can probably think of exceptions.
I think Bluebeard's Eighth Wife is an interesting example of not a divorce remarriage comedy, but a very odd perversion of that.
Actually, I think in Stanley Cavell's idea of remarriage, it's wide enough that he accommodates weird, perverted versions of that. For example, Capra's It Happened One Night, where he includes that in remarriage comedies, even though they're not married at the beginning. An alcoholic journalist and an heiress, and they meet and they don't get along at all, and they kind of spend the whole trip from Miami to New York to hate each other. And so the justification for calling it a remarriage comedy is that because they have to sleep at a motel on the way and there's only one room and they have to stay in the same room, they actually do a kind of a conjugal life, a mini episode of already being married, plus they have to act as a married couple when the police is looking for her and opens the door and they play a couple having a row, like an old couple. So they act. Again, it's about performance. And that's, I think, It Happened One Night is the most Lubitchian film by Capra. I think the philosopher Stanley Cavell, I believe he includes Bluebeard's Eighth Wife because they are married. It's just that Gary Cooper doesn't know what a real marriage is. And so she has to break it. She has to remove sex from the equation in order for him to understand. Again, to make it transactional because that's the only language he speaks.
You think that all you have to do is wave a check and no woman can resist you. But let me tell you something. There are still women in this world who have other standards. I refuse your $50,000.
Bravo!
I want 100,000.
Bravo!
I think it fits the remarriage plot. But I would call To Be or Not to Be more of a crazily perverted, genius reworking of remarriage comedy, because this thing that happens to the Tura couple is really amazing. The best gag at the end when there's this new guy in the theater who gets up and leaves on the cue To Be or Not to Be, and the aviator, Robert Stack, realizes it's not him. He's not the spring chicken lover any longer. And there's one queuing behind him. We realize that the Tura couple can only function if there's a third party involved. To me, it made me think of a new meaning of an open relationship. Because it feels like, again, that it's something you open up and there'll always be a new one. And that guarantees the fact that there is love between them. And the third person is not being used so that the two married people can just go on being married. It's much more, involved than that. But I love the fact that it's almost like a machine that needs to go on like this. And this openness to me at the end of the film is really life. It's really like history hasn't killed love in the end. There's always a new lover coming up even after the worst disaster.
Yeah, Lubitsch often portrays love, marriage, and such as a series of cycles of destabilization and restabilization, not returning to a status quo necessarily, but, in To Be or Not to Be, the inclusion of, the young pilot played by Robert Stack in this strange, open, but kind of, sort of, not really, but yes, open relationship in an interesting way is pitched as the fuel that keeps Maria Tura able to stay married to her husband. And then once our young pilot has ceased being new, the cycle restarts again. And, I like that it is, of all the reactions at the end of the film that we see, how the unnamed third man gets up. It is Sabinski who is the most concerned. He has this deer in the headlights look. I've always read that as him suddenly realizing that his position in this relationship is suddenly tenuous. Joseph Tura, he's been through this. He might have his ego hurt, but it's his ego that's hurt, not his sense of whether he will stay married to Maria. But it is Sabinski who, he might be replaced. And Maria continues on.
Yeah, and somehow I love Poland and I love my slippers.
Now listen, you. First you walk out of my soliloquy and then you walk into my slippers. And now you question my patriotism. I'm a good Pole. I love my country and I love my slippers.
Well, I hope your country comes first.
Well, so do I.
This is an emergency.
Really kind of makes me think of Heaven Can Wait. Couldn't it be the motto of the character in Heaven Can Wait? He's both very attached to what he's built, in his love, in his couple. It's almost a little too rosy, the couple in Heaven Can Wait. It's not a Paramount film, right? You talked about that. It's a Fox film. And to me, it makes it a little on the side of representing the married couple as like a comfort and a love that I didn't really find in other Lubitsch films. But then, of course, the ending. Obviously, François Truffaut, by the way, obviously took his inspiration for The Man Who Loved Women. And he dies, the guy who's such a Don Juan, he dies bending over to reach out to look at the nurse that's coming into his hospital room. And he falls on the floor and he dies in a kind of trivial, ridiculous way. Obviously, it comes from that film. Even in that, I find that Lubitsch manages to accommodate the couple and the other people in their lives.
Yeah, Heaven Can Wait is an interesting example of this. I still haven't really settled in my head whether the film is completely successful in its attempt to walk that tonal line between the couple being, I think they are sincerely pitched, at least as of the ending, in a genuinely loving relationship in certain respects. But it is based off of mutual lies, right? It is based off Henry's lie that he is faithful, and it is based on Martha's lies that she doesn't know or is okay with this. It is based on a mutual kind of détente.
And that's a problem for you? That's a moral issue?
I've loved worse characters despite worse moral problems. It's more that I haven't really settled as to what the film's authorial voice is trying to enunciate with that. And that's not a criticism of the film. It's maybe a testament to that film's deeply unsettled nuance. It's a discontent movie, but I still don't know what I think of it, if that makes sense.
But maybe you could say that about a lot of Lubitsch films, that the main characters and their lovable characters could say, I am lying. The paradoxical declaration to say, I am lying. But they are just that. I mean, Maria Tura, anyone, you name it. They're all lying and they all agree that lies are not told to be believed, I think, or something. Nobody really believes the lies, or at least they realize they're not true. It still rings, as they say in Design for Living. As long as you have the desire that keeps flowing, the lies are not really a betrayal in a moral sense, I don't think.
I think Lubitsch, he sees relationships as lying on different types of bedrock than strict fidelity and honesty in all things, I guess.
Infidelity. I always thought that the sentence in Design for Living by Everett Horton was infidelity may be fun, but not as fun as Virtue and
Three
Three
Square
Square
Meals a
Meals
Day.
a Day. And I thought it was Infidelity. See how I projected my own concerns, and it was immorality. Not quite the same thing.
I think, though, that at the very least, Lubitsch invites that reading, not the mishearing of it, but the immorality in that, I think, absolutely encompasses everything from infidelity, loose living, bohemian morality, that sort of thing.
Well, isn't that why, the ending of Angel hurts more than the ending of other films, don't you think?
I mean, there's so many different angles to the hurt of that.
I mean, I love it because it's such a small enclosed little theater. It's so intimate. It's one of the most intimate of Lubitsch films, maybe more than Trouble in Paradise, even though there's this memory of one set almost in Trouble in Paradise. But still, the ending to me is like, okay, she lets go of her other possible love lives, right? And of her being also like a prostitute. To me, prostitution in the film is actually more of an allegory of just an open love life rather than the other way around. It's not about social miscast as much as it is renouncing all the possible lives that we have to abandon in order to live our own lives.
Especially as manifested in Melvyn Douglas in that film, right? Where she almost strikes a bargain with Herbert Marshall in that movie. If you basically decide to overlook what you know, even though you don't have certainty, is probably true about me, if you decide to overlook that, I will forgo my other lives.
If you don't go in at all, you'll be a little uncertain. You won't be quite so sure of yourself or of me. And that might be wonderful.
That's a mutual bit of sacrifice both characters make. And I think the film does end on a huge question mark of whether or not that is durable, or even whether that's the decision that will make the characters happy. The film ends almost on a funereal note. It's not triumphant about it.
In a way, To Be or Not to Be's ending is a comedic rewriting of that. Just as The Smiling Lieutenant's ending was a strangely melancholy. I love that shot. When you see Claudette Colbert walking away, she's so small. I mean, she's so petite, and you see her back turned to the screen, and she just decides to give Maurice Chevalier away to the princess. It's so touching, but it's also so not Lubitsch in a way.
Girls who start with breakfast don't usually stay for supper.
You want to call her back and say, no, but you're the one who taught her all the tricks, jazz up your lingerie and all that, and then you walk out. This kind of sacrifice, like the ending of Lady Windermere's, I don't know, it seems a little, he's looking for a solution. To me, he's kind of writing all these endings, and maybe the next time he's going to find like an open relationship solution. And he does find that in Design for Living and To Be or Not to Be.
Smiling Lieutenant feels to me, and I mean this as nothing but praise, because I think that's part of what's so interesting. It feels like an unfinished project in that way, where the film gives you two endings. It gives you Claudette Colbert's ending, which is incredibly melancholy, and it does all it can to call attention to how unnecessary it is, right? How unnecessary it is that she has to be cut out of this. And then you get the goofy ending with Maurice Chevalier singing about, how great his new wife is and how he's now a fine domestic husband.
I forgot about that. I completely blocked it off.
We all remember Claudette Colbert's ending because I think the film is really preoccupied with her emotional life more than anyone else's in that movie. And then you get, again, the goofy, like,
I'll find at home my ra-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. There'll be no more campaigning, and she'll find me ra-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And so I'm not complaining. I found a new commander to obey. I must report for duty right away. She'll never pension me.
That section of the ending, the actual final shot of the film, is nowhere near as emotionally loaded. It's just like, oh, goofy, my wife now understands lingerie. Isn't that great? See y'all later. William Paul writes about this with great detail in Ernst Lubitsch's American Comedy, the sense that when Lubitsch moves on to Trouble in Paradise and Design for Living, he kind of closes that circle and actually enunciates a more completely developed vision of how he sees relationships with Trouble in Paradise and Design for Living, where eventually it's, why isn't there room for more than the conventional monogamous arrangement?
Well, I think the fact that, as we're trying to say, he's researching the matter, throughout his various films, I think it's because in our own lives, we are researching the matter and looking for the impossible, equation between freedom and being involved with someone. It seems a little too bringing things into life and not thinking that films are a representation. But I think also maybe it makes me think that the operettas, let's say, or the Smiling Lieutenant at least, they're almost like comedies that try to stifle the melodrama underneath, and like the melodramatic elements pop out at various moments in those films. And to me, that's what makes them really touching. Because when you watch a Max Ophüls German film from the same era, or where you are. It's very good, but it's going to be a melodrama. Whereas with Lubitsch, you think it's a comedy, and you see Maurice Chevalier, it's a comedy. It has to be. The guy who believes in this person. He's like a comique troupier, he's like Michel Simon in Renoir's troupier comedy. And yet, at the end, for example, you have Claudette Colbert going away, almost like in an Ozu film.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in Lady Windermere, which I think you really love, I'm a little less enthusiastic about it because somehow I know I'm in a melodrama. And so when I see her suddenly realizing that her husband may be cheating on her with that lady, suddenly the set seems very so tall. It's ridiculous. She's like a little girl, like an Alice in Horrorland, really, not in Wonderland, in her own house. It's very well done through the sets that, the doors are suddenly gigantic. Well, maybe not suddenly, but that's how I felt because of the shots, I guess, because of the distance. But so you know where you're at. There isn't really any comedic thing that makes the film composite. I actually like, in general, in all the early 30s films, when they're not what you were thinking they were going to be. Like there's a program at the beginning and you think, it's going to be a comedy or something, and then it starts and then something else happens. To me, that's the definition of like pre-classical. It's not yet classical. It's imperfect, but I find that most of the time it's very moving. You have that in Sacha Guitry's cinema, for example, in Le Roman d'un Tricheur, the one where he tells all his life from when he was a child. And suddenly you have a scene when he's recalling the moment when he was in the army and they would go to that cabaret with other fellow soldiers. And suddenly you have a real singer, I believe it's Friel, singing in the cabaret. And you're like in Castle Glory, that memory, leads to other ones.
One of the reasons I deeply love The Merry Widow so much is that it is among Lubitsch's goofiest movies. Both the protagonists are these massive egotists. It still manages to hold the tonal rug out. And, you have something like Jeanette MacDonald's rendition of Cordelia, which comes out of nowhere. I don't think the film would be one of my favorites without that moment, even though it's something that I don't think I've mentioned it on the podcast so far. It's a moment that kind of tunes the movie because it breaks the tonal rules that have been set up. It occurs in between two very silly scenes. Rafelson and Lubitsch just decide, at this point, she's going to sing a heartfelt, incredibly sad song of loneliness. And you feel things on just an elemental level. It breaks those rules of causal linkage that we associate with classical cinema. It's lovely, and the film doesn't really do that again.
And you see how even when we've entered the classical era, actually instead of turning away from this and making perfect movies, To Be or Not to Be accommodates all this. Because, of course, with Greenberg and the Shakespeare, the Shylock monologue or things like that, those disruptions are pushed to an excess that nobody else would dare to bring up. At the beginning of the film, she mentions her dress, how she would appear. Then the same gag comes a second time, I think. You can say that The Great Dictator already did that before. The shock value of those things, Chaplin had already paved the way for that.
I think if I had to draw a kind of contrast between The Great Dictator and To Be or Not to Be, though, is that The Great Dictator never commits to a segment like that occurs around half an hour into To Be or Not to Be, which is that it becomes a thriller for 10 to 20 minutes, right? There's moments of cleverness. You have the Anna Karenina business, but there's no laugh or levity to be had for a significant part of To Be or Not to Be. And then it twists that by turning all the elements we just saw the film take seriously into laugh lines. You have the horror of the sign the Nazis put up, or the series of signs of, various just warnings of, if you do this, you'll be shot or sent to a concentration camp. And then they turn that into a punchline with concentration camp Ehrhardt. That's, I think, always struck me as far more perverse and knowingly perverse than anything Chaplin was willing to do.
Well, I think it was pretty temporary to include, I think, what was a gag already in modern times, where you have an inventor coming up with a machine that doesn't work and messes up everything. Obviously, in modern times, it's the eating machine. But then he uses that again in The Great Dictator with the guy who actually comes up with a gas. It's pretty wildly, violent in The Great Dictator. And also I would argue that Chaplin's speech at the end of The Great Dictator is also daring in that he steps out of the diegesis and he steps out of character. And it's Chaplin himself who does, counter propaganda or propaganda. That was, I think, held against the film. So it's a risk. It's the little tramp's suicide. I'm glad we're bringing up The Great Dictator because there's something in To Be or Not to Be. I don't know if it's been written about, and I'm sure you've read everything about that film. And the two podcasts, they were wonderful, the episodes. It's the fact that I think it's Alexander Korda who produced. So there's a link between the two, and he gave that idea about the mustache to Chaplin, I think. So the physical resemblance between Hitler and Chaplin, and the fact that Chaplin considered, and rightly so, that Hitler had stolen his mustache. He was internationally famous in the mid-1910s. So obviously he was a star, and it's pretty believable that Hitler just stole that item. And André Bazin, the French critic who's one of the co-founders of Cahiers du Cinéma, wrote a really good piece about how it was a revenge from Chaplin because of the stolen mustache. What I like is that in To Be or Not to Be, I think Adrian Martin talked about topping the topper, how with the Siletsky plot, it's bringing the stealing of Chaplin's mustache to a different level. The story with the beard, Siletsky's beard being shaven from his dead body and then restuck on him, which is something that the viewers tend to forget. Like every time you watch the film, then you are kind of forgetting how it ends with that thing. And it's like the best gag of the film, right? That's perverting Chaplin's revenge to me. It's to go even further in simulation, which is really what I meant somehow to talking about Lubitsch in general, I guess. The genius of not just drama, not just theatricality, but really simulation. And to push it to that level, to actually shave a dead man's beard and stick it back up on him so that you're the one who has the real beard. Therefore, you're the real person. It's genius. It's absolute genius.
No, Professor, I tell you a better story. Maybe he is wearing a false beard.
Oh, I hardly think so.
Then why don't you convince yourself? Why don't you pull his beard?
I realized introducing The Miracle Woman by Capra. It's a 1931 film that's, I think, inspired by a play co-written by Riskin, but also inspired by the life of a real woman preacher. And it's Capra's second film with Barbara Stanwyck. But what really touched me this time is that he's thinking about how everything is recuperated by spectacle, right? It's about a woman who thinks she can avenge her father, who was the preacher and who was rejected because he was too old. And she has faith, we think, at first. She becomes an important preacher in her parish. But then she gets caught by this impresario, this agent who wants to make money and who says religion is only good if you make money out of it. And somehow she's young, she accepts this life of lying and of religious shows, and she tours America with these shows, and she, in a way, manipulates the masses. She makes money, basically, on her preachers. I was struck by how Capra shows that everything can be turned into a show in America. And we all know this, but like he shows it in a way that's really extreme. And at the same time, he is a man of spectacle. It's not true that he's moralizing about that. He also shows that the life of this little troupe of people is like a little circus of really poor, bad actors who make a dime, and during the preacher's shows, they make believe they suddenly regain, health because of her prayers. But he films them as really a small circus. And so it's not just a critique, it's also showing the life of actors. And that made me think, of course, of To Be or Not to Be, and how I love the fact that they're bad actors. I mean, they're hams, they're just bad. They're bad actors in so many ways, in so many different ways, but all of them are bad. And then there's history, and now they have to step up and be good. One of the scenes in To Be or Not to Be that I like most, apart from the Seletsky thing, is the one where Jack Benny, the fake Earhart, and he's with Seletsky. Because Seletsky mentioned his new relationship with Tura's wife, he maybe become her lover, that Tura, his jealousy blinds him and he doesn't act well. And he opens the wrong door in the fake headquarters of the Gestapo. And because he opens a door that's actually locked, that's it. Now Seletsky knows the whole thing is a scam and it's a mock-up Gestapo headquarters in a theater. And I love the fact that once in your life you have to be a good actor, it becomes a matter of life and death for you, for your people, for the whole Europe maybe. I love that.
It's interesting that two things you just said kind of collide in an interesting way, because they have to be good to win the day. And yet Tura's ego overrides even that. And I love that about To Be or Not to Be, where in the end, yes, they succeed, but they bumble their way through it. They aren't good at this. The whole climax is only necessary because they so badly screw up before. By the end, it's not this triumph of, wow, we really pulled together. We're great. It's we got through by the skin of our teeth because we're average people, right? These are just flawed, imperfect people like you or me. And yet that's what it takes to, in this case, beat the Nazis.
But in fact, even flawed, imperfect people like you and me get their moment, just as Greenberg gets the moment when he is going to finally say the monologue and make it resonate in a way that's not anti-Semitic for once, and that's the opposite of anti-Semitic. You're right in saying that they bumble their way through it, but it's funny how I never really saw it like that. I thought for once they get a reason to break the border between the stage and the world, I guess. And they step into history and they're really good. I mean, at first, the fake Hitler is not good, so much so that he's not resembling the picture, which is himself, the actor, and not Hitler. And at the end, the fake troupe of Hitler and his group, works out.
Oh, yes, it works. It's hard to say anyone arcs in the film, but Tura does grow, right? By the time he is impersonating Seletsky, he's the one who comes up with the beard. He bumbles through his meeting with the real Seletsky, but he, to that character's credit, takes advantage of that and learns from Seletsky so he can better impersonate him and constantly gets won over Earhart and Schultz.
Yeah, he becomes an actor turned director, just like Chaplin and Lubitsch.
Yeah, exactly. He collaborates with the director of the Polsky Theater to stage this play that, ends up saving most of them at least.
Yeah, and the way Seletsky dies on stage, it's so extreme, it's so excessive, but it made me think of Hitchcock's film Stage Fright. And then I went back to it to find the scene that also is staged on stage and how they run after each other on stage or underneath and all that. I was really disappointed in the way it's done in Stage Fright. So again, Lubitsch wins, It's not to oppose him to others, but when you get back to the actual scene, it's not as detachable and memorable.
That scene is one of the most chilling to me in any Lubitsch films. The way that Seletsky's death is played as this horrific meeting of the theatrical and the real. I think of the logistics of someone going up to the spotlight to turn it on to find him. The auditorium becomes a stage when the spotlight begins lighting it. And what actually happens on that stage, the need to kill Seletsky. Sabinski fires the shot, but it's this very mournful moment. They're all struck, it seems, equally because of their plan being, foiled. but also because of this murder. It feels like they're all genuinely sobered at the fact that they have just collectively murdered someone.
Exactly. That's what I love, is that I don't know how he manages. I mean, we do know, we're talking about this, but how he manages to keep the shock, the truly philosophical, moral shock of having one person dying within that context of super staginess and drama and theater everywhere. And yet one person dies and it's the bad guy. And we know he's the bad guy. There's no doubt about that. It's not like Lubitsch says, he was a Nazi, but he could. That's what he says to Maria Tura. I'm a Nazi, but I can be a great lover too. No. Lubitsch, he is the bad guy, but killing him still has the impossible act of killing is still very much vivid.
Last time I watched the film, I was struck by how much it feels like an ironic return of Joseph Tura's words, where he's the only character in the film who ever wishes that someone would die. And it's in the beginning when he hopes the person who left the auditorium died of a heart attack.
But he walked out on me.
Oh, maybe he didn't feel well. Maybe he had to leave. Maybe he had a sudden heart attack.
I hope so.
If he stayed, he might have died.
Maybe he's dead already. Oh, darling, you're so comforting.
And he gets his wish, right? Someone dies. It's this horrific reframing of a very funny, if dark, throwaway gag.
But to me, it's the equivalent of Charlie Chaplin suddenly addressing the audience in The Great Dictator. It's like suddenly I'm talking to you, even though he's not saying that, because there's a historical momentum. As we speak, this could be a newsreel. I find that him dying on the stage, paradoxically, Siletsky dying on stage under the spotlight and all that, makes it like almost a vision in history, in the near future. It has to happen. That image has to be composed in order for, the Jewish people to live on and for Europe to not being completely Nazified. Don't you think? It's almost like he has this vision of one day they will die. It even made me think that scene, I don't know if you're familiar with Claude Lanzmann's documentary, well, Shoah, but there's one shorter film that he did using the rushes of that 1985 documentary, and it's called Sobibor, and it's just this guy who escaped from Sobibor. He was able, him and other guys, to kill Nazis within where they were working in the camp, exactly on the dot at a certain hour. They had to kill them in order to organize the escape, and it had to be exactly at a certain time. And he managed to do that. And when he tells of how he killed the Nazi, he had an axe and he broke his skull, like right in the middle. And he remember, I think, the teeth making a little spark or something. It must be terrifying to kill someone like that. And it makes me think of that scene in To Be or Not to Be.
Sobibor, 1943. Very few films have made as big an impression on me as that one. We watched all of Lanzmann's documentaries in kind of a single week a long time ago. This does bring to mind the kind of nature of To Be or Not to Be as a film made in late 1941, right? The fact that no one involved with it could have known what was going to happen. I was talking to Matthews. We remarked about how the film almost treats the destruction of Warsaw in the way that later films would treat its total destruction later on. Only about 10% of Warsaw was destroyed in the initial invasion. That's still horrific and awful, but the film really interacts with later events with an interesting chemistry. It almost feels like the film was almost made with the next 4 years in mind and what was to happen. It's one of the most remarkable effects I've ever had watching a film, realizing that they couldn't have known about Operation Reinhardt. They couldn't have known about what was to come immediately after the movie was essentially finished. I don't really have a good word to describe it. It's uncanny.
I'm wondering if it's just because people like Chaplin and Lubitsch were following current events. They were intellectuals as well, and they were very well informed, I'm sure. And I think Lubitsch also saw Ben Hector. I don't remember who he was seeing that would have been able to tell him about things. But don't you think also it may be because two things. They're screenwriters, but they're also gag men. I mean, they think in the logical chain of things, how things become excessive, be it melodramatic or being slapstick. There's a logic of how things evolve, and you end up in such a situation that's ridiculous in a way. And I'm wondering if when you've been doing that for years, following those logics from one object to how it entangles people and becomes a quid pro quo, and etc., I'm wondering if you're not thinking of history that way. Foreseeing something that's just at the beginning could turn into, say, the final solution.
Mm-hmm. And Lubitsch would have known what Hitler's rhetoric was and what had already happened in Germany. And there was no shortage at the time of journalists, thinkers, etc., often accurately predicting that things would get much, much worse. Lubitsch was very, very well versed on current events, as you say, right? He was following the news. He was, preoccupied with, what was happening with his family and others. He was also part of a social circle of largely German Jewish directors, writers, other creatives, all of whom would have been discussing this. The idea that he would include some of that very justified pessimism in this film and let that inform the way that it depicts the invasion of Warsaw, that makes total sense.
But I still think there's an intrinsic logic to crazy fantasies of power over the world. They could understand deeply, not because they have themselves those fantasies, but because they've considered writing about characters who become delirious in a way, or situations that haven't actually happened in real life, but that have happened in fiction. I don't know if it makes sense, but it reminds me of Heaven Can Wait's sentence.
Oh boy, delirious in a foreign language.
I think if I ever write about Lubitsch, if I write an essay or something, it may bear that title.
I would love to talk about doors because you mentioned in your email, have we talked about doors enough? And I have come to the conclusion that we have not talked about doors enough. One of the many possible titles for this whole show had to do with doors, the doors of Lubitsch or something. And I realized that that was far too limiting a title.
Well, I don't have, if you want, a system that would explain, all the uses of doors in Lubitsch. But they do make you think about more general ways his cinema functions. For example, the link between theater, drama, and cinema in and of itself. You see a door in a movie. Doesn't it make you think of drama? It's like this we call it vaudeville in French, but it's not vaudeville. It's these plots where there's the husband, the wife, and then the lover opens the door. First, I think I see a door in one of his films and I think of the theatricality of the film, but not because Lubitsch's cinema would be filmed theater. Not at all. It's not that. But because of what he takes from drama and what he doesn't take from drama, what only cinema can bring up. I mean, you would say Singing in the Rain also does that, exploring the singular qualities of cinema versus stage musicals. But in a way, when I see a door in his films, I'm thinking he's thinking of drama and he's doing yet something else. That's one thing. Of course, the other thing is obvious, is that behind a door, there's sex in Lubitsch. What else?
Of course.
Behind a door, there's a bed. So like the door, it's a vertical piece of furniture, but really it literally stands for the horizontal piece of furniture, which is the bed, which I guess from 1934 on is not really a double bed. Not supposed to be a double bed. And then, of course, he uses as I said, for Lady Windermere's, it strikes me in Lady Windermere's fan, he uses the tallness of it. Of course, it's set in London. Maybe in London they have bigger bookshelves and bigger doors, but it's definitely the character is in front of these gigantic doors. It becomes a more conventional, I think, in a way, psychologization of the set. I guess it remains of the expressionistic period. Generally speaking, wouldn't you agree that every time there's a door, there's sex behind it? As in Nochka, obviously. Even in Design for Living, there's this paravent. It's a thing you put in a room in order to divide spaces. And they emerge, from behind and they say, animal, mineral, or vegetable.
Because he's such a director who relies on symbols and objects as substitutes for other things, the door is just such an obvious substitute for whatever's happening behind it, right? You don't need to be told. The very fact that there is a door there is enough to imply that therefore we shouldn't be seeing this, therefore it is something that shouldn't be seen, therefore sex. He also uses them. Design for Living, I love his use of doors in that because so much of that film is about how people especially in that flat of the two roommates. So much of it is about how they subdivide and compartmentalize their relationships with each other, right? I mean, you have the famous scene where they lay out what their relationship's going to be like, and Miriam Hopkins makes her confession that's tough to make at 11 o'clock in the morning. And the camera slowly almost auditions other partners for her. It subdivides them. Doors do that throughout the film. A door might separate two characters from one other character and therefore their sex. It also might serve to externalize two characters' division at that point before they re-enter. That film is a particularly good study in all the ways that Lubitsch can deploy that.
You're right, and it brings back the sentence I was quoting from Ninochka, I'm only interested in the distance between those 2 points. Whenever you put a door, you pretend there's a distance, you pretend there is a separation, but the whole point, the whole narrative can start when that border can flicker. And I'm saying flicker because in The Awful Truth by McCary, which I think is really a perfect film, and again, very Lubitsch, I guess, to me, the ending is really beautiful and it's really a remarriage comedy. They're in 2 rooms, and between the 2 rooms, there's this door, and because there's a draft, the door keeps flickering. And there's a whole thing about the separation one from another because they're almost divorced couple is being put into question through the way the door moves. I think Lubitsch inspired that. I'm wondering actually whether, I'm going to read up on that, whether Capra's idea of the wall of Jericho, the famous blanket put on a string in It Happened One Night, which is a beautiful image of the separation between the 2 lovers, but it's also a beautiful allegory of censorship.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was about to make the exact same comparison, except that I love that the wall of Jericho in that film is not a door, it's an idea of a door. It doesn't exist. It's even less material than a door. You mentioned that the door is pretending that there's a distance. This is pretending that there's a door.
It's pretending that there's a wall, but it's actually a thin fabric, and it makes you think of a cinema screen, of course. And it also vibrates like a membrane between the 2. And also the first time they use that device to divide a motel room, she puts all her underwear on it to use it like as a string to just, leave her things by the bed. And so it becomes even more of a cabaret, of a sexy device. I think Lubitsch would have loved that. He probably loved it. I'm wondering if that's documented, because a lot of the time I think he inspired people, but sometimes they got better ideas. I think it's better. The walls of Jericho is a better idea than a door. Sorry, Ernst.
I'd be very curious to know what Lubitsch thought of that too. There's frustratingly little, probably because he died before the big kind of mid-century history had been written. There's a drought of his thoughts on his contemporaries' films. I mean, I can only assume that he saw It Happened One Night, and I would hope appreciate that twist on it. You mentioned before this that the link between the French Cahiers critics and Lubitsch, and we briefly touched upon Truffaut specifically, but I was curious as to whether there was more that you wanted to discuss in that regard.
Well, I don't always read up on Lubitsch, like I come back to it, but then I start watching the films and I want to then read up on them, but I get caught up in the films. And don't you get that? Like, of course, you've done a lot of reading, but in a way, they're so powerful that sometimes you don't get to do the reading. So I've read this book that's called Ernst Lubitsch because it was a special issue at Cahiers du Cinéma. It was a 1985 special issue on Lubitsch that was headed by Bernard Eisenschitz and by Jean Narboni. Bernard Eisenschitz is a film historian, and Jean Narboni was the editor of Cahiers a while ago, and he's still a film critic and a film writer, and both of them are still alive. They're in their 80s. And so they commissioned various texts, not just by people from their generation. And Jean Narboni wrote a great piece that's called The Conjuration of Egos, but also from younger critics at the time, one of them being Charles Tesson, who writes beautifully about Lubitsch's mise en scène. It's called The Paradise of Troubled Waters. Just the titles of their texts are amazing. It amazes me. And I go back to that book. I mean, they turned it into a book, but I'm sure there are many other books, but I like the Cahiers approach, which does in a way stems from Truffaut's writing, even though Truffaut wrote a short piece about Lubitsch at the end of the 60s. He wasn't a critic any longer, and he wasn't at Cahiers any longer. And it's a simple piece, but I think he saw it all in a way, because he shows, but you've talked about this, how his films include, holes because they include the viewer, which is a very simple idea. But when you actually unfold the implications of that, it's in the writing, in the mise en scène, in the editing, it's great. It's like he lays out something and then you can yourself fill in the blanks. He's saying that about Lubitsch's films, but he's also doing that in his piece. And you as a film critic or as a viewer, you can actually do that about Lubitsch's films. Truffaut mentions Angel, and he compares the famous scene of Angel with the leftovers on the plate with a Goldilocks episode with the soup. Because he's bringing up that scene, it made me think that I've seen Angel maybe a few times. Sometimes I would forget it almost altogether. I don't know why, because I think it's a lovely film, but because it's so delicate, maybe my memory doesn't work very well. And so I tend to forget a lot of the films I see, even though I love them. I hate to say this, and I'm a film critic. How dare I? But I think that's why I am one. And so it made me think that, in a way, that scene from Angel, where the leftovers of the husband, the wife, and the lover are interpreted by the maître d' in the kitchen, could be an allegory of how I see film criticism.
I tell you, Mr. Halton talked so much.
Or maybe he doesn't like veal.
That's quite possible.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, make a note. If Mr. Halton should come again, no veal.
It's a melancholy thought about what it is. But what I mean is, I write mostly on current films, and I see them once, most of the time. And then I write a piece for Cahiers, and there's the next month's issue coming up and all that. And I don't have the time to study them as classics. And most of them are not rubbish, but what I mean is the leftovers and the way you are left with only these pieces of meat to make sense of the situation because you haven't actually attended it makes me think of what it is to be a film writer. You don't have the film under your eyes. You're not watching a DVD and stopping and going. And you have to do with what's left in your failing memory. It's like dead a bit, like meat, I mean, there's something very morbid about this view of film criticism, but I thought I'd submit it to you because I think it's also very loving to be doing this. Like, who does this? Who gives so much attention to ribs leftovers?
I sometimes feel that way when, realizing that I've been working on this show for over 2 years now. It almost feels like, because it's about a director who, when I started the show, was dead for 75 years, now dead for 77 years. It really feels like a very belated artistic autopsy where we are analyzing every last bit of film that Lubitsch ever put out, with one exception now that the Rosentopf case is accessible. We didn't cover that because that only became accessible a year after I'd done the Berlin years, and I kind of realized that going back would be a bit non sequitur, and the history marches forward. It does feel like historical spelunking, and I'm almost relieved to enter the present again.
But I think what you're not realizing, maybe, is that by performing this autopsy, you're not performing an autopsy. You're reviving them. I truly believe that. And especially with the spoken media, be it in film clubs or be it on the waves, I really think there's something about making them alive again. Not that they need us in a way, but sometimes they do, because the way you talked about the Merry Widow, like, who watches The Merry Widow? And it's an absolute masterpiece. It's not like an autopsy, and it's not like looking into the pieces of meat. And so I think what I meant about being a film critic is more like accepting the loss of even just one film, because you're translating sounds and images into words, which is already a gap, and of course filtered through your failing memory and your emotional filters. And it's beautiful about criticism. I like it. But it does have to do with necrophilia in a way. Whereas I think what you do is you delve into the films so much that you're almost doing what the Borges, the Argentinian writer, one of his short stories in fictions is the story about the map whose scale is 1 = 1. And I think because your series is so monumental, has turned in so many episodes, it's almost covering the work of Lubitsch like a 1-1 map.
I once had the idea to line up all the episodes on my editing software to see if it's actually longer than Lubitsch's surviving filmography. And at this point, I think it might be. It's my type of excess. Normally, that was such a beautiful sentiment. I would just say, like, that's it. That's the episode. But you did mention one thing very early on that you want to delay. And that's that you had an anecdote from your love life that you thought was relevant to Lubitsch. If you don't want to mention it, that's totally fine, but I'm too curious.
No, actually, no. I don't think it will be kept in the episode because, oh my God, this is such an anti-Lubitchian climax. There is no Venetian ashtray in my commentary. It was just a reflection upon the fact that is it possible that watching, 100-year-old films, as you said, may have influenced one's own love life, not just views on cinema, on mise en scène, and etc., but even like moral and existential choices in one's life. And maybe because I watched them as a kid, or maybe my first approach of sex was through his sex comedies, I think it did influence my idea of an open relationship, which is something that a lot of people have a hard time even conceiving. Just like Joseph Tora, opening the wrong door because he's really too jealous. And so, maybe everybody will die because he's too jealous. And I think his films, obviously designed for living, but also to be or not to be. And even Trouble in Paradise, I think when they sink in at an early age and you rewatch them throughout your life, I'm wondering whether it's not really shaping that possibility. It may be true.
It is an interesting kind of counterfactual to the way that, the vast majority of us are conditioned by, the art we watch, right? If you hear an idea enough times, it becomes the truth to you. I only really kind of fully immersed myself in Lubitsch in my 20s.
You were already lost for the cause.
Yes, I was lost. It's fascinating to hear from you that it preset you to have a broader idea of what constitutes a relationship.
After a few decades.
So that's really interesting. We can do a Lubitsch social experiment where we bring up a generation of kids only watching movies that have more libertine views and see if you have a greater degree of happiness.
I can see you have big plans for the world.
Yes, I'm one of those megalomaniacs that Lubitsch would totally understand. Thank you so much for joining us. I think that was a wonderful note to end our penultimate episode on.
Thank you so much for accommodating my disorganized ramble, and thank you so much for the show. Really.
Next week, Tim Brayton joins us to discuss Cluny Brown in the grand finale of How Would Lubitsch Do It? Head over to ernstcast.com for information as to where you might find the films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes and our Discord server. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. Griffin Sheel was our dialogue editor for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast platform you happen to use. It helps other people find our podcast and therefore find Ernst Lubitsch. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.